I was working at Thomas with a work train when a tornado struck. The camp car was raised completely off the track and set back down. The top was torn off the station, and two complete rows of houses behind the station were damaged or destroyed. All the power lines were torn down. Our crew worked all night helping to rescue people from their houses. There were several residents injured and several killed. After I became an engineer, I never bothered to qualify for passenger trains. You were supposed to have 3 years experience as an engineer before running passengers, and a lot of younger guys jumped in there and qualified. I never bothered to qualify though, because passenger trains were the lowest paying jobs in the railroad. That was because the engines were light and the company paid according to the engine weight.
Both my dad and I were able to get a train over the road as fast as possible. My dad was known as Flywheel Senior, and my nickname was Flywheel Junior, or sometimes Little Flywheel. When we stayed overnight in Elkins, we stayed in boarding houses. One boarding house was better than the rest. You couldn't beat it. The lady who ran it had clean beds and the best food. Her table always had 3 kinds of meat and several kinds of potatoes and vegetables. We ate like kings, and it only cost us 50 cents. We had a National Railway Historical Society trip to Elkins during the fall when the leaves were changing. We had 4 or 5 picture stops. We would pull by, let the passengers off, and then back up. Down by Haddocks, there was a beautiful place on the curve where everyone could see the colorful trees for a long way. There were some really pretty views.
When we were up on Cheat Mountain, we lived in a caboose. Some of the other men, they stayed in a camp car. The company had camps all along the railroad where we could eat. The company also had extra gangs that moved from siding to siding, and they would have cooks in their camp cars. We were charged for each meal and would pay our bills every payday. I'd eaten a meal for as little as 6 cents. The Western Maryland, they ran a passenger train out of Elkins to both Belington and Huttonsville. The train ran to both towns on the same day with the same crew. Every other day, Phil Dowdy, he was an engineer. He was a red-faired fellow with one peg leg. Well, he would go down to Belington and Huttonsville. He would then take the train down to Durban on the alternate day. Heyman Schoonover would alternate on the 2 runs with Phil Dowdy.
Sanford Fisher, my great-grandfather, was a section foreman who helped build the Western Maryland west of Hagerstown. My grandfather was a railroader too. As a boy, he earned 50 cents a day carrying water to the section men. He later became a Western Maryland conductor. My father and several uncles worked for the Western Maryland. When I was a boy in the 1930s, I carried lunch to my father when he worked in the Hagerstown yard office. I started working for the Western Maryland in November of 1948. When my son Steve started railroading, he became the 5th generation to work for the Western Maryland.
The reason the company wanted to dieselize in Elkins quicker than any place else was because the women's organizations complained of the smoke and dirt. They made it so hot for the management that they called up Mr. Cook and said, "We've got 10 brand new diesels just out of LaGrange. We're going to send them down to the Elkins division." I'll admit that smoke was bad, but it meant jobs, and there was going to be a lot of men without jobs when steam was replaced with diesels. We had to have the large workforce that we had for steam because the work was so heavy. After we turned to diesels, It was just like working on your automobile. You went out and started it and stopped it whenever you wanted to. The only difference, as far as I was concerned, was that you left the diesel running to prevent it from freezing, and you put your car in the garage. Now, don't get me wrong, I like diesels, but I hate diesels. I was brought up under steam, and I like steam because it was alive.
When there was a wreck, you didn't get to go home until after the wreck was cleaned up. Pay was good when we had to clean up. We used to like to see the trains have a wreck, although I always hated it when there was a wreck on our own section. That's because the company would throw 4 or 5 crews in there, and they would hurry and throw the track back together any way they could to get the trains moving. After that, everything had to be all worked over. One time we were sent up to Cheap Cut. We went in there on a nice day. The cars were scattered all over. We started working in the morning and worked all that day and all that night. It began raining at sunset and started snowing around midnight. I'll tell you, after getting wet in the rain and snow and riding back home in an open truck, we were all about frozen to death. The foreman said, "Now boys, get yourself some dry clothes on and some breakfast and then come back. Got some work to do here in the yard." Well, none of us came back until the next morning.
One of my first long-term assignments was at Glady, West Virginia, on the Durban sub. I was there for about 18 months, starting in 1929. The station had burned down shortly before I arrived, so all we had was this little watch shack. It was so crowded that we had to pile the coal for the stove behind the office. Instead of a train order board, we used flags to let the train crews know that we had orders for them. If we had nothing for them, we'd put out the green flag. If we had orders, we'd pull out the yellow flag. And if we wanted them to stop, we'd put out the red flag.
My hometown was Clear Spring, Maryland. I was raised by an uncle who told me about a job opening as a clerk typist for the Western Maryland. I was interviewed and hired by Mr. E. Welch, who was one of the train masters. I graduated from high school in June of 1944 and started on the midnight shift on the next Sunday. We worked 7 days a week, no days off. My pay was $6.36 per day. Clerks were primarily involved in record keeping. Clerks worked as agents, timekeepers for payroll, the records office, and various other offices. For many years, women working in the Hagerstown yard office were not allowed to cross the yard tracks whenever they needed to go to the restaurant on the corner of Burhans Boulevard. Instead, we had to drive over or walk to the restaurant under the underpass. One day in 1945, the westbound desk clerk told me, "I'll take you across the tracks." So we went over, ate, and came back. His father, who was a yard master, met me outside the yard office. He didn't say a word to his son, but he sure got me. My last day was June 1987. I miss the people. We were really like a family.
To be a conductor, you had to do a lot of studying and know the book of rules. Each time, from the moment a new timetable takes effect, it supersedes the preceding timetable and its initialants and stations and such divisions or subdivisions. Stuff like that. Once you got through the exam, you never had to take it again. The engineers had exams on air and machinery and all that stuff. A rough time, too. It seemed like the fellows who couldn't get along were the engineers and the conductors. They always squabbled a little bit. The engineers wanted to be the boss, but if they got in trouble, the company didn't ask the engineers why they got in trouble. The company asked the conductors.